Public sector. 10. The basic philosophy of a feudalistic monarchy is that the king owns the entire kingdom, its manifest as well as unmanifested resources. Kautilya in Arthashastra clearly demarcates the spheres of economic activities between the state and its subjects. Thus, the concept of public sector, private sector and joint sector was delineated. Ownership of land. Land, the most important resource, was primarily in the public sector, with the state holding all virgin land, forests and water resources. However, both public and private sectors held arable land. States' lands were either directly cultivated by the chief superintendent of crown lands, or leased out to tenants. Land was granted to private parties either in perpetuity or for a limited period, on a tax-paying or on a tax-exempt basis. A park, an embankment, a water tank or a reservoir associated with arable land could be privately owned with a transferable title. Mining, fishing, and salt pans. Mining and fishing were both in public and private sectors. Salt pans were in the public sector, but salt making was done by the lessees of salt pans. The chief salt commissioner collected the revenue before it could be marketed. Manufacture and sale of liquor and betting. Manufacture and sale of alcoholic liquor and betting were the state's monopoly. Any private parties engaged in these activities were severely punished. Precious metals and jewelry and precious stones. Since time immemorial and in ancient sacred texts, gold and silver were mentioned as most valuable metals. Whether these metals were largely mined or imported is not known, but Kautilya recognized the importance of these metals, and emphasized strict control on sale, purchase and manufacture of these metals as well as precious stones. Profit in public sector. According to Kautilya, profit was a must, and not anathema in operating public sector undertakings. The main guiding principles of the administration of the economy were that the state should run a diversified economy actively, efficiently, prudently and profitably. A few references are enough to show how much importance was given to profit-making in Kautilya's public sector undertakings. Any official who did not generate adequate profits in a crown's undertaking was punished for swallowing the labor of workers. Chief controllers of state trading who looked after trade with foreign countries were told to generate profits, avoid losses. Clear regulations were spelt out regarding buffer stocks and futures in which profit-making was emphasized. When crown commodities were sold by private parties or merchants, they had to pay a charge to compensate the state for the profit which it would have otherwise got by selling them direct. Animal husbandry. The state also was engaged in many diversified activities. Crown herds were the responsibility of the chief superintendent, who either employed cowherds, milkers, etc. on wages or gave some herds to a contractor. Private herds could also be entrusted to the state for protection on payment. There also appear to be veterinary doctors in the employment of the state. Forestry. The state's participation in protecting and developing forestry cannot be minimized. Factories were set up in the forests for producing useful articles by the superintendent of productive forests and the chief ordnance officer. The well-protected leisure forests, intended for the king's pleasure, had plantations bearing fruits, thornless trees and pools of water. They were stocked with tamed deer, wild animals rendered harmless, and tamed elephants. Mining. Mining was in the public sector. Mines, the source of war material, were important because mines are the source of wealth. From wealth comes the power of government, because with the treasury and army, the earth is acquired. The following metals were mentioned by Kautilya in his treatise: gold, silver, copper, lead, tin and iron, alloys of copper such as brass, bronze and bell metal. Diamonds, precious stones, mica, as well as marine products were considered part of the mining industry. A number of officials, under the chief controller of mining and metallurgy, were responsible for these industries. Manufacture. Two categories of manufacture were under the state's monopoly. They were making weapons and brewing liquor. State-controlled industries were textiles, salt and jewelry. State-regulated industries were small-scale industries of craftsmen such as goldsmiths, blacksmiths, weavers, and dyers. Local and foreign trade. Both public and private sectors were engaged in local and foreign trade. The controller of state trading was responsible for the equitable distribution of local and foreign goods, buffer stocks and sale of crown commodities. He could also appoint private traders as agents for the sale of crown commodities at fixed prices, or sell those directly through state-owned retail outlets. The official in charge of exports, the chief controller of state trading, was advised to undertake foreign trade only if there was a profit. Exporting weapons and valuable material was prohibited. Public sector units. Though Kautilya wrote in the context of a monarchy and the governance that prevailed in his time, there are certain fundamental points of relevance that we can cull from his propositions about those activities that come within the purview of present-day public sector units. 1. The Arthashastra emphasized that the king should build forts, canals, roads, and moats, and as a matter of fact it describes with considerable detail the layout of each of these infrastructural constituents. It is not the precise applicability of each of these specifications, but the fact that this is meticulously described in the Arthashastra, which underscores that Kautilya recognized that efficient provision of these amenities entailed adherence to certain parameters. 2. The second aspect is Kautilya's exhaustive description of the duties and responsibilities of the entire gamut of functionaries within the monarchy, ranging from the ministers, councillors, and commissioners to the officers at the lowest level of the hierarchy. Furthermore, the Arthashastra enumerates corrective and preventive measures such as penalties and a system of vigilance to ensure the efficient discharge of the responsibilities of those in various tiers of governance. Penalties were also used for the enforcement of revenue targets and expenditure limits. Evidently, Kautilya understood the importance of accountability and transparency, the lack of which in a number of public sector units has been a prime reason for the proliferation of loss-making public sector enterprises. 3. Interestingly, one can draw discernible similarities between some of the provisions of the Arthashastra and the main principles of corporate governance. For instance, according to the Cadbury Committee's report 1992 on financial aspects of corporate governance, proper managerial accountability was the key to any system of corporate governance. Its view was that companies that adhered to its code of best practice would experience improvement on the effectiveness and value of its audits. The Arthashastra spoke of the king appointing spies to ensure a system of vigilance that would be able to monitor the activities of various departments, and although this may not be termed as an audit, it would have served some of the purposes that an audit is supposed to fulfill. There has been extensive research on this subject in today's times. However, one of the central objectives of corporate governance is to ensure accountability and transparency through certain managerial and legal provisions. Headhunting. 11. Winning over SEDUCIBLE and non-SEDUCIBLE parties in enemy territory. Kautilya described the behavior of those who could be won over when needed. There were 4 types of behavior that he felt made a man seducible: anger, fear, greed, and pride. Why these 4? Many of Kautilya's teachings and policies were influenced by the Vedas, which tell us that a human being is made up of mind, body, and intellect, brain. Of these, the body acts either at the command of the mind or at the insistence of the intellect. Intellect is defined as the capacity to control the mind, and this comes from study and reflection. The mind is a collection of our feelings, emotions, thoughts, etc. While intellect rationalizes, the mind dictates the emotion. Further, the mind is insatiable, it wanders perhaps even faster than the speed of light, and it gets attached. All these things make one dependent on the world. A person feels stress when his mind rules over his intellect. This is the state of unfulfilled desires. Whereas when intellect rules over the mind, the desires become aims and ambitions. Unfulfilled desires could lead one to anger. The mind experiences this as an obstruction to what one desires. Greed. When the craving or the desire becomes very strong, this leads to arrogance, which with the passage of time becomes envy. Envy leads to fear, losing what one has. The 4th state that the Vedas talk about is moha, delusion, but Kautilya lays stress on pride in a man that relates to arrogance as the 4th seducible element. How do we identify these people? The group of enraged anger is exhibited when one's desires are obstructed. This group includes those who felt cheated or denied after being promised certain rewards, increment in pay, status, etc. One of 2 or more persons, who being equally competent, feels humiliated because the other is assigned a job. One who feels slighted because his superior favored another. One who is unable to deliver results on account of being given a difficult assignment. One who feels the stress on being transferred to a far-flung area, or an area of his dislike. Kautilya considered both those willing to be transferred but considered the remuneration improper, and those unwilling to be transferred. One who is on an assignment not of his choice. One who cannot achieve his objective in the organization even after trying hard and giving his best, perhaps because of a fault in the culture of that organization. One who is hindered from doing his duty either due to paucity of time or because of not being given requisite authority to do the task. One who feels underpaid. One deserving, but deprived of an office he aspired to. One held back by his peers or superiors in an organization for their own interests. One who is reprimanded and or punished, whether such reprimand, punishment is justified or not, after serving the organization loyally. One who feels the other got credit for the work done by him. The group of those who are frightened. This fear is one of losing something. The group includes one who has thwarted or pulled down someone. One who had committed a serious wrong, a deliberate act detrimental to the organization. One who has become known for a wrongful act, perhaps in his personal capacity. One frightened by the punishment meted out to another for a like offense. One who has seized someone else's work or credit. One who has been subdued by authority. One who has suddenly amassed a lot of wealth at the expense of the organization. One disliked by his superiors. One who has entertained hostility towards his superiors, or the organization itself. The group of those who are greedy. These people are in a state of overwhelming desires. This group includes one who is impoverished for money, respect, opportunities. One who has faced a calamity. One who has indulged in vices either in personal or professional capacity. One who has indulged in rash transactions. Rashness of transactions may have involved a financial loss or expectation of a great gain. A person who believed in personal gain by withholding information. The group of those who are proud. This relates to arrogance that follows greed. This group includes one who was filled with self-conceit, self-importance, pride, vanity, snobbery, arrogance. One who desires achievement of honor. One resentful of the honor bestowed on a colleague. One placed in a lower position than he had envisaged for himself. One fiery in temper. One given to violence, physical, verbal or non-verbal. One dissatisfied with his emoluments. After identifying these four groups, Kautilya prescribed how to approach them. To lure the enraged. Reinforcing perceptions such people hold about their organization by telling them how their organization and managers lacked the knowledge, common sense and also the experience to see what they were worth, also to explain to them the detrimental effects that such behavior of their organization and managers could have on the organization, by inviting them then to join another organization to realize their potential. To lure the frightened. Reinforcing the sense of insecurity by warning them of a possible harm that they risk getting from their organization due to its own incorrect apprehension of being harmed by them, showing them a safer haven where they could grow. To lure the greedy. Reinforcing the desire by amplifying the fact that their organization rewarded those who were devoid of spirit, intelligence, and eloquence, but not those endowed with the qualities. Presenting an alternative organization which has a culture of acknowledging and rewarding persons of distinction and asking them to join. To lure the proud. Proud people need to get their ego massaged. The approach used should be to impress upon them that their organization is fit for and is of benefit to only people with lower qualities and little or no intelligence, conviction or abilities, not for people of the standing. Inviting them to join an organization that knows how to honor persons of distinction. Selection of people. Though the kingdom was a feudal monarchy, it had a well-structured administrative machinery containing various departments, and the heads of these departments were charged with well-specified responsibilities. They were expected to run the team actively, efficiently, prudently and profitably. The highest authority was the king himself, who was advised by a group of councillors, ministers and other high officials, who were carefully selected by the king himself after a careful scrutiny of the character, background, and leadership qualities. Qualities for appointment. Kautilya believed in the adage, Yatha Raja Thatha Praja, as the king is, so will be the people. Therefore, he laid down the condition that an ideal king is one who has the highest qualities of leadership, intellect, energy and personal attributes. Nepotism had no place in Kautilya's scheme for holding high offices. For the king, or in modern times, the prime minister, these important qualities were emphasized. Qualities of leadership. We have to view these qualities in the context of the political social milieu of Kautilya'S times. Qualities that were then desirable were birth in a noble family, good fortune, intellect, and cultivating associations with elders, being righteous, truthful, resolute, enthusiastic, and disciplined, not breaking a promise, showing gratitude to those who help, being holy, and not being dilatory. Qualities of intellect. This included the desire to learn, listening to others, grasping, retaining, and understanding thoroughly, and respecting knowledge, rejecting false views, and adhering to the true ones. An energetic king is one who was determined, valorous, quick, and skillful. Personal activities. An ideal king had to be eloquent, bold, and endowed with a sharp intellect, a strong memory, and keen mind. He should be amenable for guidance. He had to be well trained in all martial arts and have the ability to lead a disciplined and trained army. He had to have the ability to govern in normal times and the capacity to face crises. He had to conduct himself in accordance with the advice of elders. The king himself scrutinized persons whom he appointed to high posts as counselors, ministers, commander-in-chief of the army, and heads of various departments in his kingdom. Conclusion. The king appointed counselors and ministers after carefully scrutinizing the birth, abilities, character, and suitability for taking up the high posts. The king had to personally supervise the work of those ministers near him. With those further away, written communication was used. According to Kautilya, the king had to thoroughly test the integrity of those whom he had appointed. Kautilya also cautioned the dangers inherent in king's service. Service under a king has been compared to living in a fire, but is, in fact, work. A fire may burn a part of one's body and, at its worst, all of it, but a king goes from one extreme to another. He may either confer prosperity or may have the whole family, including wives and children, killed. Therefore, a wise man makes self-protection his first and constant concern. Specific qualifications were laid down in Arthashastra for the appointment of the heads of the departments. 34 heads of departments were listed by Kautilya. Only those who had the specified qualifications were appointed to these high posts. Except in the case of Raj Purohita, the scribe Brahmin, and army Kshatriyas, there was no caste reservation for the high-level posts. Thus, upward mobility in the hierarchy was based on merit, suitability, and fulfilling other qualifications laid down for these posts. Water management. 12. Kautilya'S views on water issues speak volumes of his foresight and clear thinking, the most striking being the concept of user charges practiced in his time. Today, even after consensus on user charges, there are still practical obstacles in the way of implementing these. The tax holiday, so far thought to be a product of modern times, was prevalent in Kautilya'S times as well. For example, for the purpose of the creation of irrigation facilities, exemption from payment of taxes was provided for a terminal period of 3 to 5 years in case of new tanks, renovation, and cleaning. Since all water resources belonged to the king, the levy of user charges helped the king replenish his treasury. Due to risks involved in transporting goods via waterways, the land route was preferred. Among various water routes, coastal and river routes were preferred. King's dictum: water for irrigation and cultivation. All water reserves belonged to the king, and users paid a water rate for taking water from irrigation works built by the king. Irrespective of whether the cost of building a dam or an embankment was borne entirely or only partly by the state, all the fish, ducks, and green vegetables produced in or near the reservoirs are the king's property. Irrigation. For building or improving irrigation facilities, the following exemptions from payment of water rates were stipulated to be granted. New tanks and embankments, 5 years. Renovating ruined or abandoned water works, 4 years. Clearing water works overgrown with weeds, 3 years. Waterworks such as reservoirs, embankments, and tanks could be privately owned, and the owner was free to sell or mortgage them. The ownership of tanks would lapse if these had not been in use for a period of 5 years, except in cases of distress. Anyone who leased, hired, shared, or accepted a waterwork as a pledge, with the right to use it, was obliged to keep it in good condition. Owners could give water to others by dredging channels or building suitable structures, in return for a share of the produce grown in the fields, parks, or gardens. In the absence of the owner, either charitable individuals or the people of a village acting together had to maintain waterworks. Water, various other uses. Dams built to store water from a flowing source, such as a river, are preferable to those built to store water brought by canals dug for that purpose. Among reservoirs built by constructing dams on rivers, the ones which irrigated a larger area were considered better. Kautilya gave importance to productive use of water and water routes. Despite the fact that water routes can be used to transport a large quantity of goods at less expense and exertion as compared to land, Kautilya preferred the latter. According to Kautilya, the water route is not usable at all times, is accessible at only a few places, is full of dangers and is indefensible, in contrast to land routes. Further, among water routes, a coastal route is better than the high sea because there are a large number of ports along any coast. A river route is also good because it poses less serious danger and is more constantly in use. Safety of water routes was emphasized. This has been dealt with elsewhere. The Director of Trade had to be conversant with the differences in prices, the popularity or unpopularity of various goods, and know whether they were produced on land or water and whether they had been transported by land or water routes. The state was responsible for making sure that only a seaworthy boat, properly manned and equipped, was allowed to set sail upon paying of penalty for any loss suffered for want of seaworthiness. Ships sailing on the sea had to pay duty whenever these came within the king's domain. Boats that were shown to cause harm, those coming from enemy territory and those violating the regulations of the port were to be destroyed. Contrast the emphasis placed by Kautilya on efficient water management and the detailed instructions on how to do it with the current neglect of this God-given resource. India is blessed with several large rivers, flowing from the melting snows of the Himalayas and also fed by the southwesterly rains. Yet for thousands of people living in villages, especially women and children, obtaining this basic requirement involves trudging for miles and carrying it on their head. The last two budgets, emphasizing the maintenance of water bodies, point out the gross neglect of maintenance of this vital natural resource and its contamination. The Arthashastra would be very instructive to those charged with the responsibility of conserving our water resources. It is unfortunate that in India, despite 6 decades of planning, an efficient and equitable water management program is still a pipe dream. In this respect, Kautilya as a visionary has many practical suggestions to offer.